The morning was dense with fog, a quiet, unrelenting fog that draped itself over the spires and quads of Oxford like a worn shawl. I had taken to wandering the city before the colleges had fully awakened, the streets empty but for the occasional clop of a bicycle or the scuff of a cautious pedestrian. Pusey Stair, tucked behind an unassuming set of wrought iron gates, drew me with an almost imperceptible insistence. There was a cold stillness to the stone steps, the kind that spoke more of absent warmth than of presence. That was when I noticed the letter, its folded edge slipping from beneath the second step, pale against the grey stone. I picked it up, feeling the slight crinkle of paper under my fingertips. No envelope, no signature, only the inscription, Professor H. I felt an immediate, inexplicable weight in my chest, as though the stair itself had breathed its own caution into the air. Oxford in the fog tends to render everything more solemn. Even the pigeons seem to hesitate before settling on ledges slick with mist. I stood for a moment, the letter unopened, absorbing the stillness. Somewhere behind a closed window, a piano whispered an uncertain chord, slightly off-key, an invitation or a warning. It was hard to tell. I had not intended to involve myself in mysteries that morning. A glass of whiskey and the crossword at home would have sufficed. Yet there is always a tug when something is placed deliberately, and I could not deny the tug. I slipped the letter into my coat pocket, the edge brushing against my hip as though nudging me toward questions I had not yet formed. A faint scent of ink lingered, iron tang mixed with the subtle musk of paper left too long in quiet corridors. It is in such small things that one begins to feel the shape of events before they arrive. Descending further, I allowed my mind to wander. Who had placed the letter, and why here? Was it intended for Professor H, or was it a lure for an observer, a stray mind wandering through the cloisters as I had wandered? The stone beneath my shoes was worn unevenly, each step a reminder of centuries pressing silently into the present. My gaze lingered on the intricate metalwork of the gate, noting the minor imperfection in a twist of iron, an old repair or recent tampering. I could not tell, and yet it seemed significant in its quiet insistence. The letter, I realized, was a harbinger of something more than news or complaint. Its placement suggested intention, its absence of signature a threat or a confession. I imagined the writer, slender and deliberate, threading their way through the fog, leaving only a trace for those perceptive enough to notice. The irony, as ever, is that what seems inconsequential often bears the heaviest truth, and it is seldom the loud declaration, but the faintest murmur that directs the eye of investigation. I paused at the top of the stair, letting the fog curl around me, absorbing the solitude, the muted echoes of distant footsteps. The city was waking, slowly, and I was already several steps ahead, reading in the silence a puzzle yet unsolved. Pusey Stair, ordinary yet insistent, had whispered its first clue, and I, with a mind given over to minutiae and melancholia, had listened. Somewhere in that fog, a story waited, and the first letter of it had already left its trace beneath my feet. I returned to my quarters that morning with the letter still in my coat pocket, its weight heavier than paper alone could account for. The fog had lifted only marginally, leaving Oxford's spires veiled in a gauzy persistence that seemed determined to slow thought and motion alike. It was there, amid the quiet hum of my kettle and the faint rustle of the Times, that I first became aware of Dr. Harold Telford's death. The notice was brief, tucked between a society column and a report on rowing results, almost incidental, yet the phrasing carried a peculiar, cautious deliberation, unexpected demise, tragic accident, pending inquiry. Something in the clipped language pricked at my attention, as if the words had been chosen to conceal rather than reveal. I wandered through the college courts later, partly to clear the residue of fog from my mind, and partly because one cannot entirely ignore Oxford when it presses itself into the consciousness. Conversations drifted past me, hesitant and careful, glancing at the subject without fully naming it. A junior fellow, cheeks pale from either fear or cold, murmured about Telford's recent paper on Renaissance mathematics, a study said to provoke quiet scandal among certain dons. Another whispered that Telford had been ill, though the illness seemed less substantiated than the gossip itself. Each account conflicted slightly with the others, a subtle discord that, to a trained ear, suggested more than mere rumor. The office where Telford had worked was sealed, a simple brass plaque marking the door. I lingered at the threshold, noting the tilt of a letter opener on the desk, the precise alignment of books along the shelves, the faint curl of paper that had been hastily set aside. It was in these details, trivial to the casual observer, that truth often hides. A quotation from Eliot on the notice board caught my eye, slightly misattributed, the punctuation altered, an echo, perhaps, of its author's own internal tension. The thought occurred that Telford, meticulous in life, would have noticed such an error immediately. Whether it had been left by him or another would prove significant later. A call from Lewis interrupted my rumination, and his voice carried the thin excitement of someone who has overheard more than intended. He mentioned a neighbor having seen Telford climbing the stairs late the previous evening, notebook in hand, face drawn tight with concentration. I inferred from the cadence of Lewis's report that even he sensed a subtle discrepancy, a timing that did not align with the supposed accident. Yet the details remained elusive, shadows cast by fog thicker than that of the morning. I returned to the letter briefly, brushing its edges with a thumb, as if the paper itself might offer insight into the man whose life had been so abruptly ended. The scent of ink lingered faintly, mingling with the chill of my quarters. In the silence, I imagined Telford's steps echoing along empty corridors, the meticulous ordering of his room, the quiet intensity of his gaze as he wrestled with ideas that, for reasons still obscure, had placed him in peril. It was not fear, but a delicate, anxious care that marked his final movements, discernible only in the small, overlooked details that would later prove pivotal. By evening, I had come to a private conclusion. Death, though whispered and concealed, always leaves a trace. Whether through an off-hand remark, a misaligned object, or the faintest echo of a misquoted poet, it speaks to those who listen attentively. And I had begun to listen, to notice the subtle ways in which Oxford itself, with its creaking floors and damp stone, bears witness to what occurs within it. Telford's end was only the beginning of what would prove to be a delicate unraveling. Oxford has a peculiar way of enclosing its inhabitants, as if the colleges themselves are breathing walls, guiding and containing every action, every misstep, until the city seems to shrink inward, focusing attention on what is hidden rather than what is obvious. By mid-morning, I'd begun to trace the contours of Dr. Telford's final day, wandering the cloisters and staircases that he had known so well. Each doorway I passed, each corridor lined with worn tapestries, seemed to watch as much as I did, cataloguing a scholar's life in echoes and shadows. It was here, amid quiet reverence and faint draughts that stirred dust motes, that I met the first of those whose lives would intertwine with his death in ways both subtle and sinister. There was Dr. Carlyle, his eyes constantly darting to imagined interruptions, a man whose scholarship on medieval rhetoric appeared impeccable, yet whose hand trembled slightly when reaching for a teacup. His composure, I noted, was deliberately theatrical, and it suggested both pride and a need to conceal embarrassment. Then Miss Fairchild, a visiting poet and scholar, aloof yet present in every conversation, who moved through the quad as though the stone beneath her feet were a stage set specifically for her observation. And finally, a junior fellow named Briggs, whose polite deference barely concealed irritation, the subtle stiffness in his shoulder betraying a man accustomed to restraint, yet prone to sudden, impulsive gestures. I found myself observing patterns rather than asking questions, Noting that Miss Fairchild had left a faint smudge of ink on her sleeve as she reached for a volume of Dante, that Briggs's polished shoes bore traces of clay inconsistent with the known paths of the day, that Carlyle's watch was set slightly fast, a discrepancy he might have attributed to mere inattention. Each triviality was a potential signal, and in Oxford, trivialities accumulate like sediment until the deeper meaning emerges. It is in these tiny deviations from expectation that the outline of truth begins to appear. The letter I had recovered from Pusey Stair continued to weigh in my pocket, its absence of signature and deliberate placement a silent prompt. I could not yet see the full picture, but I sensed the circle was closed around me, the suspects and the deceased, a delicate lattice of proximity and secrecy. Telford's death, though outwardly simple, seemed to have generated a web in which each participant played a role, consciously or otherwise, in the unfolding narrative. I paused in the fellow's garden, noting the wet gleam of leaves and the faint smell of autumn decay. Here, one could almost hear the unspoken rivalries that had simmered beneath cordial greetings, the carefully measured politeness, the gestures loaded with implication. It occurred to me that any one of them might have known more than they admitted, might have glanced at Telford in a way that revealed envy, curiosity, or concealed anger. And yet there was no hurry to reveal, only the slow accrual of evidence like notes in a symphony awaiting their resolution. In the library later, I discovered another layer of brief correspondence between Telford and each member of this closed circle. Minor disagreements over interpretation, a misattributed quotation here, a withheld annotation there. As I read, the quiet hum of gas lamps and rustle of parchment reminded me how Oxford preserves its secrets patient, measured, waiting for a mind willing to see beneath the surface. Somewhere in those letters, in those gestures and small omissions, was the first glimpse of clarity. I only needed to wait and to watch for the moment when the lattice would loosen enough to reveal the shape within. I remember the afternoon I first saw Telford's notebook, its leather cover worn and faintly scuffed, as though it had been carried through long walks beneath the rain, absorbing the faint scent of damp quads and aged paper. I had been invited, politely and without pretense, into his chambers, ostensibly to discuss the circumstances surrounding his work, though the invitation felt more like an opening to a private archive than a social courtesy. Among loose sheets and neatly stacked volumes, a single poem caught my attention. Its lines were arranged with a peculiar rigidity, punctuation deliberately irregular, the spacing almost obsessive. At first glance, it seemed merely personal exercise in rhythm and sentiment, but there was an undercurrent, subtle and deliberate, that hinted at something more. The poem began with the faintest echo of Shelley, yet diverged into imagery uniquely Telford's own. A river not flowing, a tower immobile, letters slipping from grasp before recognition. I traced the line breaks with a fingertip, sensing in the indentation a pattern, an intent. One does not stumble upon a concealed clue merely by looking. It is in the consistency of deviation, the careful alternation of emphasis, that a cipher begins to whisper its presence. I made a mental note to return later with paper and pencil, to map the poem's rhythm against known events, to see what might emerge from a mind so meticulous, yet so quietly burdened. As I turned the page, my attention flickered to a blot of ink, smudged faintly in the margin, as if in haste or distraction. It was an almost imperceptible deviation from Telford's otherwise flawless hand, yet it suggested urgency or interruption. The small, overlooked mark whispered at a potential timeline, hinting at movement, at the crossing of paths with someone or something whose presence had been undetected. Oxford is full of such minor betrayals, a misplaced step, a misaligned book, a shadow cast by nothing more than curiosity, and yet enough to illuminate intention if one is patient. Miss Fairchild was present, quietly observing my scrutiny, her eyes flicking to the poem with a mixture of professional interest and something indefinable, perhaps unease. Her hand lingered on a volume of Keats, and the faint smudge of ink on her sleeve did not escape my attention. I did not voice the observation, merely catalogued it internally, a detail that might acquire significance once the poem's hidden trajectory became clear. That is often the way with clues. Their importance is measured not at discovery, but at convergence, when multiple minor observations intersect into coherence. I reread the verses aloud, carefully, feeling each cadence against the quiet hum of the room, the faint creak of floorboards, the distant toll of a college bell. Certain phrases lingered in a misplaced key, words left unspoken, the shadow between towers. They seemed almost literary, almost decorative, yet their irregular pattern and repetition suggested intentionality, a personal map disguised as verse. Somewhere within those lines was a fragment of truth, not evident to casual eyes, a whisper of motive, perhaps, or warning. By the time I left the chamber, the fog outside had thickened again, curling around the spires and quads, carrying the scent of damp leaves and distant coal smoke. The poem remained in my mind, folded and slightly smudged, a reminder that the most innocuous appearance often conceals deliberate design. I knew then that the first thread of this mystery was not to be found in the overt, in the newspaper clipping or whispered rumor, but in the quiet, precise obsession of a scholar's hand, where intent hides beneath rhythm and meaning waits patiently for perception to catch up. The following morning I took to my usual haunt, a small cafe tucked just beyond the Bodleian gates, where the smell of fresh pastry mingled with the faint musk of damp paper and worn leather. It is a place that encourages observation, and as I settled into a corner with a cup of bitter tea, I allowed my eyes to wander over the crossword in the Oxford Mail, as I often do when thought requires gentle stimulation. The clue for 17 across, misplaced letters in the academic tower, struck me with an almost imperceptible jolt. It was the sort of construction Telford would have found amusing, a veiled reference perhaps, and yet the answer, when carefully traced, suggested more than mere playfulness. There is, in puzzles, the same precision one finds in scholarly verse. A misstep, a misalignment, can illuminate a pattern unnoticed by casual observers. I watched the patrons, noting the slight nods and murmurs between fellows over the morning paper. Miss Fairchild was present, seated near the window, her fingers tracing an absent-minded path along the rim of her cup. The ink smudge on her sleeve from our previous encounter was now faintly visible in the light, though I suspected she believed it long forgotten. Briggs entered shortly thereafter, his polished shoes leaving thin, wet traces across the floor, and he cast a fleeting glance at the crossword that betrayed a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. It is often in such micro-expressions that one discerns intent. One observes how attention is allocated, how the mind prioritizes trivialities that might otherwise seem irrelevant. I allowed my pencil to hover over the crossword, reflecting on Telford's poem, the letter from Pusey Stair, and the small inconsistencies that had begun to form a lattice in my thoughts. The poem's punctuation, the letter's careful anonymity, the smudge on Miss Fairchild's sleeve all hinted at a convergence, a pattern of subtle signals leading somewhere beyond the immediate. I noted, for instance, that the crossword's clue echoed a motif in Telford's work. Displacement, misalignment, something left intentionally imperfect to provoke reflection. Was it possible that the poet's cipher and the puzzle's clue were in quiet dialogue? Such coincidences, however charming, must be treated with caution. Oxford delights in such intellectual traps. Later, while tracing the route Telford had taken the previous evening, I noted a contradiction that had previously escaped me. The junior fellow who claimed to have seen Telford ascending the stairs at 9:30 had mentioned a distinctive cough, yet the medical records indicated Telford had suffered from a mild cold earlier that day, insufficient to produce such a sound at that hour. It was an almost negligible detail, yet in combination with the crossword's latent suggestion, a subtle dissonance emerged, a flicker of the larger truth obscured beneath layers of civility and routine. By evening, as I returned to the quiet of my rooms, the fog thickened again, clinging to the quads with a persistent chill. I traced the crossword's answers against the poem's lineation, aligning misplacements and repetitions. I realized that the faintly obsessive attention Telford had paid to detail was mirrored in the trivialities of those around him, the smudge, the glance, the hurried step. Each indicated awareness, participation, or concealment. It is in such convergences that the first tentative threads of comprehension appear, teasing the possibility of coherence without yet revealing it fully. Oxford, in its quiet grandeur, had whispered again, and I had listened. The discovery of Telford's correspondence was less a matter of chance than a slow accumulation of curiosity and circumstance. I spent a morning in the dim quiet of his college office, noting the subtle tilt of letters in the pigeonholes, the uneven stacking of envelopes on his desk, the faint residue of wax that suggested hurried sealing. It is remarkable, and in Oxford rather typical, how intention can be disguised in triviality. The neat script, the careful address, the deliberate choice of paper, all acting as a mask. Among these letters were exchanges with his closest colleagues, exchanges that, upon first reading, appeared courteous, even banal, but upon closer inspection carried hints of friction, misattribution, and careful omission. One letter struck me in particular, a note from Briggs that seemed polite and apologetic on its surface, yet the phrasing contained a subtle contradiction. Briggs mentioned a meeting at precisely 5:30, a time he could not have attended according to his own later statement to the porters. The discrepancy was minor, almost dismissible, but in the accumulation of such details, one begins to perceive a pattern, the faint outline of deliberate misdirection. I made a careful note, the kind of detail that might escape notice if one were to read for content alone rather than rhythm, pause, and phrasing. Another correspondence, this between Miss Fairchild and Telford, seemed an outwardly innocuous exchange of scholarly observations, but there was a hesitation in the syntax, a slightly unnatural formality, the type that signals an unspoken tension. Her words avoided direct reference to a prior disagreement, yet it lingered between the lines, as if the paper itself carried the echo of a suppressed argument. Observing her later, her gestures betrayed an awareness of something left unsaid, a subtle fidgeting that suggested the letter had not merely informed but constrained her. The faint smudge of ink on the corner of her sleeve, previously unnoticed, now seemed to align with the moment she might have penned the final line, a minor trace of presence left behind. On a further note, Telford's own phrasing intrigued me. There was a misquoted poet, a line slightly altered, not to deceive, but perhaps to signal an inclusion designed to attract attention to the inconspicuous. The repetition of unusual capitalization, the deliberate spacing of words, hinted at a minor code or a hidden emphasis, as though the writer was leaving breadcrumbs only perceptible to a mind attuned to such precision. Oxford cultivates such subtlety, the fine interplay between what is written and what is suggested, and it is in these nuances that one begins to perceive motive and possibly culpability. Even the sequence of delivery carried meaning. Letters placed together, retrieved in a particular order, suggested either coincidence or careful orchestration. The minor inconsistencies once catalogued began to form a lattice of suspicion, each thread supporting the notion that Telford's death might have been foreseen, or at least intersected with a pattern of concealment. Small gestures, a folded corner, a smudge, an overwritten word spoke volumes when one was willing to listen. And I, as always, was listening. By the evening I had returned to my rooms, the fading light casting a pale wash across the pages I had examined. The letters and their subtleties formed a quiet narrative of tension, rivalry, and misalignment, an echo of the poem, the staircase, the misquoted poet, and the faint discrepancies noted earlier. Lies, like shadows, accumulate quietly, and letters, carefully arranged, can serve both as instruments of revelation and instruments of concealment. Somewhere within that lattice, I sensed, the next clue waited, and as ever in Oxford, it would be discovered only by those who had patience to see beneath the surface. The college archives, with their low ceilings and the faint smell of dust and aged parchment, have a peculiar intimacy. Each shelf seems to breathe quietly, as if recalling events that the present might never fully grasp. I spent an afternoon sifting through boxes of old photographs, official event portraits, and group shots of dinners long past. Most were unremarkable, faces arranged in neat lines, smiles practiced for the camera. Yet, in one overlooked envelope, tucked behind several large format images, I found a photograph that arrested my attention immediately. Telford seated beside Briggs in another, a visitor now obscure at a gathering 10 years prior. The arrangement of the figures, their gestures, the subtle tension in their shoulders, suggested an intimacy carefully concealed by time and formality. I studied the photograph with the methodical patience that Oxford seems to cultivate in its most disciplined scholars. The position of hands, the slight tilt of heads, even the direction of gaze conveyed a narrative not present in the accompanying captions. Telford's expression was faintly strained, a tension at odds with the overt joviality of the occasion, while Briggs's posture hinted at defensiveness, a man attuned to the judgment of others. The visitor, unknown in name yet familiar in bearing, leaned just enough to intrude upon the personal space of Telford, an act that might have been socially acceptable at the time, but in retrospect carried an undercurrent of unease. It was as though some past collision of ambition, envy, or pride had been crystallized into a single, unremarkable image. Later, I compared the photograph with the letters and poems I had already examined. The overlap of subtle gestures, repeated habits, and phrasing within the correspondence suggested a continuity of tension, a thread extending from that single photograph into the present circumstances of Telford's death. Miss Fairchild's previous ink smudge, the misaligned crossword clue, the deliberate spacing of lines in Telford's poem all resonated with the same precision of concealment and revelation. Details, so easily overlooked, began to converge. I found myself returning, repeatedly, to the photograph, noting the almost imperceptible scratch along its lower corner, likely caused by hasty handling. It suggested a recent search, a disturbance meant to remain unnoticed, yet precisely the sort of minor imperfection that Oxford teaches one to value. Even a small detail, a fingerprint upon dust, can serve as a signpost toward understanding. In this quiet, measured reflection, I began to perceive a subtle web of intentions and omissions, the lattice of academic rivalry and unspoken grievances that could so easily culminate in tragedy. The room was silent except for the faint scratching of my pencil as I took notes, cataloguing names, gestures, and discrepancies. The smell of old paper mingled with a faint hint of damp stone from the walls beyond. Somewhere in the photograph's frozen tableau lay an unspoken directive, a hint toward motives obscured by courtesy and habit. Time, I reflected, has a way of preserving both innocence and culpability with equal care, and it is in the act of observation that these preserved moments begin to breathe again. By evening, I'd left the archives, the photograph carefully returned to its envelope, my mind tracing the intersections of past and present. Oxford's twilight light fell across the quads in long, muted shadows, and I realized that the puzzle was no longer simply about what had happened yesterday or today, but about the quiet weight of memory, the choices made and unmade, the gestures preserved in images, letters, and the faintest markings. Somewhere in that lattice of time, the next piece of clarity waited, imperceptible yet inevitable. It was an evening softened by drizzle, the kind of Oxford rain that glazes cobblestones and leaves the air redolent of whetstone and distant peat smoke. I made my way to the college's small theatre, an intimate space where the acoustics favored the whisper of a sigh as much as the full sweep of a soprano. The program that night was modest, a chamber opera of subtle motifs and quiet tension, yet even in its simplicity, it carried echoes of the human passions that drive both art and folly. I took my seat near the back, a vantage point that allowed observation without intrusion, noting the precise alignment of ushers, the polished gleam of brass rails, the slight imperfection in a carpet seam that seemed to have gone unnoticed by everyone but me. The performance began, and as voices wove in harmonious, yet sometimes dissonant patterns, my attention was drawn as much to the audience as the stage. Miss Fairchild was present, her gaze fixed not solely on the singers, but occasionally darting toward the entrances, as if expecting someone to appear or vanish. Briggs was there as well, the set of his shoulders betraying a tension that the measured applause failed to dissipate. The layering of gestures, glances, and pauses formed a quiet narrative parallel to the one unfolding in music. It is astonishing how much the body can betray when the mouth conceals intent. A faint exchange of words behind a velvet curtain caught my ear, not loud enough to interrupt the performance, but distinct to anyone attuned to subtleties. One phrase, Telford's name, coupled with a reference to a particular event months prior, hung in the air, a whispered acknowledgement of knowledge, or perhaps accusation. I catalogued the moment, noting the speaker's hesitation and the slight tremor in emphasis, a detail easily dismissed, but rich with potential significance. The misalignment between speech and the surrounding quiet, like a misprinted note in the score, resonated with the discrepancies I had observed elsewhere. The misquoted poet, the overlooked letter, the photograph whose gestures spoke volumes in silence. During the interlude, I allowed my eyes to wander to the program itself. Its annotations, almost imperceptible pencil marks in the margins, seemed deliberate, a reader noting more than the music, perhaps registering timing or gesture for purposes not immediately apparent. I compared this with Telford's poem and the misaligned lines, the Pusey Stair letter, and the subtle ink smudge on Miss Fairchild's sleeve. Each minor anomaly whispered a rhythm of attention and care, of presence and omission that transcended simple coincidence. The faintest traces often carry the heaviest implication. As the final act unfolded, a note struck unusually flat, a silence in the orchestra coincided with a subtle shift in the audience. Briggs leaned slightly forward, Miss Fairchild's fingers tightened around her program. In such moments, the smallest details illuminate broader truths. It is in observation, not conjecture, that understanding begins. Oxford, with its damp stones and echoing halls, provided the perfect theatre for subtle revelation, and I, as always, attended to the spaces between sound and silence, gesture and intention. Walking home afterward, the drizzle thickened, coating the quads in a reflective sheen. The opera lingered in my mind, not for melody alone, but for the interplay of observation, restraint, and hidden dialogue. In the folds of measured performance and audience reaction, a fragment of insight had taken shape, quietly urging me toward the connections that would continue to reveal themselves only to those patient enough to see the music behind the movements and the human story behind the art. I returned to Pusey Stair late that night, the quads deserted, cloaked in mist, the damp, stone cold beneath my shoes. The fog had thickened since morning, curling like a cautious spectre around the railings and beneath archways. There was an almost tactile hush to the place, the kind that suggests both concealment and revelation. I carried the letter from the stair in my pocket, folded and faintly creased, as though it had been waiting all day for my attention, an unspoken invitation to scrutinize what had been left behind. The stairs themselves seemed more intimate at this hour, each step creaking with quiet insistence, the echo mingling with my own careful breathing. I knelt briefly at the base of the steps, inspecting the precise location of the letter's placement. The fold was not casual. It had been tucked deliberately beneath the second step, angled so that a casual passer-by might miss it entirely. The edge bore the faintest impression, almost imperceptible, suggesting a gloved hand had placed it, or perhaps one that had lingered too long. Such minute considerations often betray intention in ways larger gestures cannot, and Oxford provides endless opportunity for those willing to notice. As I stood, I allowed my eyes to sweep the surrounding quad, the low lamplight casting long, uncertain shadows that intertwined with the fog. A faint smear of soot along the stair's base caught my attention, subtle but inconsistent with any recent maintenance. It was the sort of detail easily overlooked, a minor displacement, yet when combined with the placement of the letter and the known movements of Telford the previous evening, it suggested a presence that had not been recorded, a deliberate passage meant to go unseen. Small, deliberate anomalies often speak louder than declarations. I unfolded the letter once more, the slight scent of ink and paper mingling with the damp air. Its phrasing, careful yet pointed, had lingered in my mind since discovery. One line, particularly, seemed to mirror a subtle deviation I had noted in Telford's poem, the deliberate omission of a word that ought to have been present. Such absences, when catalogued alongside misplaced gestures and minor inconsistencies, often illuminate motives that direct observation alone cannot reveal. I traced the lines with a fingertip, noting a slight indentation that suggested hasty writing, or perhaps an interruption. Either way, the physical trace reinforced the temporal sequence of events, a minor yet significant index of human presence. My gaze returned to the stair itself, noting the subtle angle of wear, the faint depressions in stone where footsteps had lingered, the unremarkable scuff that aligned, almost too precisely, with the edge of the letter. It occurred to me that every act, however trivial it may seem, leaves a whisper behind, a trace that accumulates into narrative if one has the patience to assemble it. Each overlooked detail, each irregularity of gesture, each shadow on stone was a syllable in the quiet story that had unfolded here. By the time I withdrew, the fog had begun to lift, leaving the stair etched in pale lamplight, the letters of past movement faintly legible to an attentive eye. The lattice of intention and accident, of concealment and inadvertence, had become more coherent. Pusey Stair, ordinary in appearance yet precise in its subtleties, had offered its contribution to the mystery, and I had listened. Somewhere among these minor revelations, the path toward clarity was beginning to take shape. The morning brought a brittle light, filtered through thin clouds, and with it the sense that patterns were beginning to coalesce. I returned to the college with deliberate slowness, retracing familiar corridors and quads, my mind turning over every small inconsistency, every ink smudge, each letter, photograph, and line of Telford's poem. Oxford seemed quieter than usual, the stones absorbing rather than echoing, as though even the architecture anticipated revelation. My approach that day was measured. Understanding seldom arrives in haste, and the most intricate truths reveal themselves in the patient accumulation of observation. I began with the letters, arranging them in chronological order, paying attention not only to content, but to form folds, punctuation, marginalia. Briggs's note, previously innocuous, revealed its subtle deception when aligned with Telford's own responses. The temporal mismatch and the evasive phrasing hinted at a deliberate misdirection, a small attempt to obscure presence at a critical hour. Miss Fairchild's correspondence similarly assumed a new significance, the previously ignored hesitation in syntax now suggesting a concealed awareness of events, a mental accounting of who knew what and when. Even the ink smudge on her sleeve, minor as it seemed, became a marker in the sequence, a silent witness to actions otherwise unseen. I revisited the photograph, noting again the position of Telford and Briggs, the subtle lean of the visitor whose name remained unrecorded. Something in the alignment suggested more than casual proximity. It hinted at tension sustained over years, a silent contest of authority and influence. When coupled with the letter and poem, a lattice of motive and opportunity began to emerge, and I recognized the quiet elegance of human error compounded by pride and rivalry. The clues, previously scattered and ambiguous, now whispered in concert. Cross-referencing the Pusey Stair placement, the poem's coded omissions, and the interspersed observations from the opera, I perceived a series of deliberate signals, minor but cumulative, pointing to the sequence that led to Telford's death. Each participant's gestures, words, and silences, catalogued over time, began to align, revealing intersections of presence and intention that had seemed coincidental before. The misquoted poet, the crossword's veiled hint, the overlooked scuff on the stairwell contributed to a coherent temporal and psychological map, allowing a reconstruction of events with an almost literary symmetry. I found a quiet moment in the Fellows' garden to reflect, the damp scent of leaves and stone mingling with the residue of observation. Understanding, I realized, does not always arrive with dramatic confrontation. It often emerges in the private reconciliation of disparate threads. Oxford, with its persistent fog and reflective surfaces, teaches patience, and that day, patience yielded clarity. The lattice of small truths had coalesced into a pattern. Telford's demise was neither random nor solely tragic. It was the culmination of human pride, misjudged caution, and unspoken rivalries. By evening, the steps, corridors, and quads held an almost philosophical silence, the kind that encourages reflection rather than spectacle. The lattice of misalignments, deceptions, and subtle interventions had been mapped, the narrative visible in its quiet coherence. I left the college, the fog lifting gently, aware that while resolution was near, the human echoes envy, regret, the silent calculus of decisions would persist beyond any immediate explanation. The unraveling, as it turned out, was not merely the revelation of fact, but the quiet, inexorable convergence of observation, patience, and understanding. The day had a peculiar stillness, Oxford wrapped in an almost unnatural quiet, as if the city itself anticipated the closing of a story it had long observed. I carried the letter from Pusey Stair in my coat pocket, now soft from handling, its presence a constant tactile reminder of the path that had led me through corridors, quads, and the quiet intimacies of correspondence and poetry. In a small corner of my room, I unfolded it once more, allowing my gaze to linger over each carefully chosen word. What had seemed an innocuous note at first now revealed its rhythm as deliberate, each phrasing a prompt, each omission a suggestion, as though the writer had anticipated my attentiveness. I reflected on the chain of small events that smudged ink on Miss Fairchild's sleeve. Briggs' hesitated statements, the overlooked indentations in the poem, the photograph with its frozen tensions, and realized how each had converged into a coherent narrative, subtle yet persuasive. It is astonishing how the quiet accumulation of minor anomalies can illuminate intentions, motives, and presence with a clarity that larger gestures cannot achieve. The letter's phrasing, its deliberate absence of signature, was itself a testament to careful observation and strategic ambiguity. I recalled the moment I had first noticed the minor scuff on Pusey Stair, almost trivial, yet now rich with significance. The misaligned punctuation in Telford's poem, the crossword clue's gentle nudge, the faint hesitation in the voices of those surrounding him, all coalesced into a lattice of insight. Oxford, with its damp quads and echoing corridors, encourages such meticulous reading of human behavior. The city teaches patience, and in the spaces between observation and deduction, one finds a clarity that is almost philosophical. I read the letter aloud quietly, tracing the syllables with a soft fingertip, noting the subtle emphasis implied by the line breaks and spacing. Each word felt like a footfall across the polished stone of a cloister, deliberate and careful. The writer had left not only a message but a map, an invitation to understand beyond the superficial. The puzzle, which had appeared so fragmented when first encountered, now revealed a cohesive shape, a reflection of human pride, error, and unintended consequence. In the late afternoon, I visited the fellow's garden, the damp air thick with the scent of autumn leaves and stone, where shadows lingered long and precise. I allowed the weight of what I had pieced together to settle, noting the quiet gestures of passers-by, the measured distance between steps, the faint rustle of pages from a nearby library window. It is in these private, almost imperceptible movements that one perceives the persistence of human intention, the echoes of actions and choices now fully illuminated by accumulated observation. As evening descended, the light softened into a diffused gray, and I replaced the letter in its pocket, feeling the gentle crinkle beneath my hand. The narrative had reached its necessary conclusion, yet it was not the sort of revelation that demands fanfare. The human echoes, envy, caution, and unspoken rivalry remained in the air, persistent and unresolved. Oxford, as ever, held its secrets even as it yielded its truths. The letter's end was, perhaps, the only moment of quiet certainty in a labyrinth of subtle observation, leaving one with a melancholy sense of understanding and the unspoken knowledge that life's complexities rarely offer tidy closure. Dawn arrived slowly over Oxford, the quads wrapped in a soft, rolling fog that dulled the edges of stone and wrought iron alike. I walked alone, boots muffled against the wet flagstones, the air carrying the faint tang of smoke from distant chimneys and the earthy residue of damp leaves. The city seemed suspended, caught between night and day, between revelation and lingering uncertainty, as though even the architecture itself was hesitant to let the story conclude. I carried no letters, no notes, only the quiet residue of observation and the mental catalogue of gestures, glances, and subtle anomalies that had accumulated over the preceding days. I paused at Pusey Stair, the place where the first trace had appeared, and allowed my gaze to follow the worn contours of each step. The crinkle as of paper was now memory alone, yet the sense of intent remained palpable in the way shadows pooled in the corners, in the faint depressions of stone where a hand or foot had lingered. Oxford has a way of preserving its histories in such minutiae, one need only have the patience to perceive them. I traced, in thought, the movements of Telford, Briggs, Miss Fairchild, and the others, each intersecting in the lattice of small truths that had guided me toward comprehension without offering spectacle. Human complexity, I reminded myself, is rarely neat. The fog thickened, curling along the edges of railings, through archways, and around the benches where leaves gathered in damp heaps. I reflected on the letters, the photograph, the poem, and the minor contradictions that had, in combination, revealed a pattern of human pride and error. Each observation, whether a misquoted line, a smudge of ink, a hesitant phrase, had contributed to the quiet unraveling. Yet, as ever, the human echoes persisted beyond the clarity of deduction. Envy, regret, silent rivalry, all lingered in the air, imperceptible to those untrained in the reading of subtle signs. A faint bell rang from one of the distant towers, its resonance softened by the mist, and I allowed myself a pause. The rhythm of the city, of stone and water, of footsteps muffled in fog, had guided me as surely as any concrete evidence. In its muted cadence, I perceived the interplay of consequence and intention, the echo of a scholar's obsession, and the human calculus that had resulted in Telford's end. It is in such moments, when the world itself seems to conspire in quiet revelation, that one recognizes the depth of what has occurred without needing to articulate every facet. I continued through the quad, the fog pressing lightly against my coat, inhaling the subtle combination of rain, stone, and wood smoke. Each window, each closed door, seemed to hold a whisper of the past, a shadow of the conversations and gestures I had catalogued. Oxford preserves its secrets in layered echoes, in the minor details that accumulate and persist. My steps echoed softly, and for a moment the world felt both intimate and expansive, a lattice of memory and observation that no single resolution could wholly encompass. By the time I reached the edge of the quad, the first pale light of morning revealed glimpses of spire and tower through the mist. The story had reached its necessary quiet conclusion, yet the city retained its melancholy rhythm, its suspended breath. Telford's death, the letters, the poem, and the lattice of observation had been reconciled in understanding, if not entirely in human terms. The fog, retreating slowly, left the quad poised between revelation and mystery, a reminder that Oxford, in its reflective and patient way, holds both clarity and ambiguity in equal measure, leaving one to walk onward with knowledge tempered by reflection and a quiet, enduring melancholy.